Welcome to Brief Encounters and to the March episode of Season 3 of the Securities Regulation and Enforcement series. My name is Valerie Mirko. I'm a partner at Armstrong Teasdale, and I'm also the leader of the firm's Securities Regulation and Litigation practice. And with me is my co-host, William Nelson.
Yeah, hi, Valerie. It's William Nelson. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisors Association. And I'm really excited today. Believe it or not, we have a celebrity guest, and it's our own Valerie Mirko, who recently testified on the Hill. I believe it was on March 5th that the House Financial Services Committee, the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, held a hearing titled The Role of Self-Regulatory Organizations in U.S. Markets, examining FINRA and the MSRB. So Valerie, just to get us started, I'd be interested to hear your experience. How did you get asked to go present to Congress? What was the process? How did it feel sitting in that seat, speaking to members? I think it's just really, really interesting.
Thank you. And it was really exciting. It's not something that happens often to partners in private practice. So I was very excited to do it. When we recorded the February episode about the February 4th hearing on the SEC, I had not yet been asked if I was interested and available in testifying at this March 5th hearing. So it is amazing how quickly all of this can happen, right? So to sort of go back in time a little bit, in January of 2024, I had co-authored a white paper with Peter Chan at Baker McKenzie for the Financial Services Institute, and the white paper was entitled Recommendations to the SEC to Modify its Procedural Framework to Prevent Regulation by Enforcement. And we talked a little bit about the white paper in our February episode, William, because it was part of Peter's testimony when he testified in February. And a couple of weeks after the February hearing, the staff from House Financial Services and from the Capital Markets Subcommittee reached out to me and asked me if I would be interested and available in testifying on March 5th. And they had initially found me because of the white paper. And the way this works, and I think it's fine to share this publicly, is when you're being considered to testify in front of a congressional committee or subcommittee, you generally receive outreach from the staff, and then you generally have a call with them, which is a little bit like an interview. They ask you what your point of view is on a variety of policy issues. And I had a very strong point of view on the SEC's oversight of FINRA. I finished law school in 2005. I was a 1L summer intern at the SEC. So I've sort of lived and breathed securities regulation and particularly enforcement defense, for going on, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, 23 years. So I have a lot to say. And one of the things I've always found really interesting is the concept of delegated authority, because Congress delegates authority to the SEC. And then when you look at the SRO model, the SEC further delegates its authority in these very surgical ways. But, these things evolve over time. There was a time where FINRA was not FINRA. There was the NASD and there was NASDAQ, and there's the structure looked completely different until about 15 years ago. And now we have the current status quo, which is the SEC and FINRA, and of course the MSRB and so forth. The focus of my testimony, though, was very much on the SEC's oversight of FINRA. And it really sort of the themes of my testimony already started coalescing during this initial call with committee staff. And ultimately, I was selected to testify, and I provided written testimony that had 10 recommendations focusing on various areas of SEC oversight over FINRA and then on some of FINRA's activities.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, one, I'm not surprised that you got asked to testify, and I watched it. You did an amazing job. For me, I thought it was great because as someone who watches a lot of these hearings, good or bad, they don't always tend to be as substantive as they should be, but this was a very substantive Good hearing with a lot of good questions asked, a lot of great responses. But you had brought up, you provided written testimony to the subcommittee, included 10 recommendations. Could you maybe just walk through at a high level, kind of your testimony and what your recommendations would be for the SEC and FINRA?
Sure. And that's great because it gives me a chance to talk yet again about the written testimony, which was very much a team effort. And Devin Goodall, who's a government relations professional at Armstrong Teasdale's government relations affiliate, was instrumental in drafting the written testimony. And as all of us who have been in DC for a long time and have contributed to congressional testimony, it is always a team effort. So the written testimony focused on 5 areas, specifically improving SEC and board oversight of SRO governance, addressing fairness and due process concerns of SROs, eliminating SRO inefficiencies and duplication, increasing fairness and efficiencies in the rulemaking process, and then finally correcting weaknesses in FINRA's arbitration process. So those were the 5 themes. And they really they align to a lot of different areas of debate. So the first one, which is about improving SEC and board oversight of SRO governance, focused on how both the SEC's role in overseeing FINRA, and one of my recommendations is to have either the SEC chair or an SEC commissioner as a non-voting member of FINRA's board. And then another one of my recommendations was really to take another look at SRO board composition. And, should there be more industry members? Should it be an even split? So that was the first section. The second section, which was about addressing fairness and due process concerns of SROs, this was particularly close to my heart because I largely defend enforcement matters. And something we talk about a lot is when we're in a situation of an industry bar, FINRA has a lot of power over both broker-dealers and broker-dealer representatives. So I provided some suggestions when, should FINRA take the path of a bar or an expulsion, that there be additional layers of SEC review. There are currently layers of SEC review for a broker-dealer firm, but there's not the same parity for broker-dealer representatives. And so that's the focus there. The third section was on eliminating inefficiencies and duplication. This is, always something we think about, particularly when it comes to oversight. So one of my recommendations, again, because I largely do enforcement work, recommendation 6 of the testimony speaks to amending the existing GAO oversight report requirements to include specific oversight of FINRA enforcement. I do think that's important, especially as we're seeing the SEC's enforcement manual has been updated. FINRA has said that it would be making the FINRA enforcement manual available. So I think this is where having greater transparency and using that existing GAO report would be valuable. There's additional recommendations under this category, including amending the Exchange Act to require SROs to publish their annual reports and budget and just make that sort of more uniform across SROs. I also address in the testimony FINRA's role as a technology vendor, both to FINRA, but then more broadly to other regulators and in the context of the consolidated audit trail. The last 2 sections of recommendations, one is focused on rulemaking, because again, this is, we talked about delegated authority, and one of the recommendations under the rulemaking section is to review delegated authority for rule approval as well as the process for how rules are approved, specifically noting that the Commission or the SEC should have final approval over economically or systemically important rules, whereas other rules that are being adjusted for inflation can be approved through simple notice, through trading and markets. So that's really getting at the nuances of how the SEC oversees FINRA rulemaking. And then finally, recommendation 10 calls for a study within the next 270 days to examine minimum requirements for arbitrators. I myself don't do a lot of arbitration work, but I have partners who do arbitration, who defend arbitrations, who contributed to this section of the testimony. And it's something we hear a lot. Those of us who represent broker-dealers in a variety of ways, I largely represent them in the enforcement context, but we always hear how arbitration and the arbitration process can be improved. And I thought it was really important that if I was testifying about FINRA and the oversight of FINRA, that I should include concrete recommendations to improve the arbitration process.
Yeah, no, and those are all terrific. And, your written testimony you provided the committee, you spoke a lot during the hearing about delegated authority. One question, from your perspective, you've made all these great recommendations. The subcommittee is obviously very focused on these issues. What do you see from FINRA, maybe over the next 6 months to a year? We know they have their FINRA Forward program. They've, made recent announcements related to the enforcement manual, as you noted, related to arbitration. But, what do you maybe see from FINRA? And then if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you see from Congress as well, what role they may play.
Absolutely. And I really want to commend FINRA for the FINRA Forward initiative. And I did mention that in both my oral testimony at the beginning, in my introduction, in my statement. And I also mentioned it in the written testimony. I think FINRA is being very thoughtful through FINRA Forward. I think FINRA as a whole is being very reflective on its role as well and being very constructive. So while my testimony does provide a lot of recommendations for change, it is in the spirit of constructive change. I think FINRA needs to continue to exist. It serves a very important role in regulation. The SRO model makes a lot of sense for the broker-dealer industry because while we think of broker-dealers as, the sales practice and the retail broker-dealers, we cannot forget that broker-dealers are core to the infrastructure on which our capital markets rest. And FINRA, as the broker-dealer SRO, is a key component to how well this infrastructure continues to function. So I think it's very important for FINRA to continue with the SRO model. Can there be improvements? Absolutely. Is FINRA working on improvements as we speak? I believe they are. We're seeing it through FINRA Forward. We're seeing it through a recent arbitration proposal that came out just a few days before the hearing. I referred to it obliquely, but very specifically, the FINRA head of enforcement, Bill St. Louis, earlier in March said that the FINRA enforcement manual would become available for the first time. These are all very healthy improvements that FINRA is making towards greater transparency, which is important for us as defense practitioners. It's important for the industry that FINRA is the SRO of. And it's also important in terms of the SEC's oversight of FINRA.
Yeah. And again, I think you make some really great points in that I think FINRA, really has been trying to move the ball with its FINRA Forward project, with their other initiatives. I know they just updated their electronic delivery rules as well. So I think you're absolutely right that they have been making a lot of good progress. And as far as Congress, it could be interesting. We have the midterms coming up. There's a lot going on in the world. If the House changes hands to the Democrats, we did just have Chairman Atkins up on the Hill not too long ago. It could be a very different tenor to a hearing where the Democrats have the majority. But is there anything, you think Congress may do or have a role in the next, maybe 6 months to a year related to this issue of FINRA oversight or, more specifically, their oversight of the SEC, who oversees FINRA?
No, I think that's a great question, William. And the 2 points that I felt the subcommittee really engaged with, and, I got the sense that there would be some action on. One was surrounding the idea of amending the existing GAO oversight report requirements of FINRA. So just to give you some background, the Dodd-Frank Act required GAO to review the SEC's oversight of FINRA every 3 years. and has a specific, currently 11 areas of oversight. Now, what's very interesting is that the GAO is not currently required to review the fairness and transparencies of FINRA's enforcement program. And I think that that's a gap, and that's a gap that Congress could easily fill by reviewing the GAO oversight report requirements, require at a minimum a review of FINRA enforcement. And if you were to watch the hearing or read the transcript, you'll see that that point comes up 2 or 3 times. And there was real sort of alignment within the subcommittee around that point. The other point that there was alignment on was just greater transparency around the budget of SROs, the need for SROs to publish annual reports and budgets. Those already happen, like both FINRA and the MSRB release an annual report and a budget summary. This is a hallmark of good governance, but it's being done largely on a voluntary basis. And the budgetary component is only disclosed at a summary level. So that is why one of my recommendations was for Congress to amend the Exchange Act to incorporate a requirement to publish an annual report and budget for SROs. This would codify existing voluntary practices. It would expand them. It would ensure more transparency. And, FINRA can and should consider requiring line item budget disclosures as well. Both of those recommendations really came up in multiple ways during the hearing. So I do think there will be movement on those. But Congress has a lot of options in terms of how it can expand requirements around the SEC's oversight of FINRA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely saw that in the hearing as well. A lot of focus on, strengthening SEC supervision, increasing budget transparency. There was, a lot of talk, even in a bipartisan fashion, about, are the budgets getting bloated and is the compensation aligned, with the work they're doing? So I definitely thought all that was interesting, and Congress can play a role here, like you said. So I am really excited. Over the next couple of months, we'll see any potential movement on these GAO oversight reviews, or like the other recommendation you made about adding SEC representation to the SRO boards. We'll just kind of have to see. But again, you did a wonderful job. It was a great hearing. I really do think that both Congress and FINRA definitely really benefit from those recommendations.
Thank you, William. I really enjoyed having the honor and the privilege to testify at this hearing. It felt very natural for me to be there, probably because I've thought of these issues for a long time in a variety of contexts. So I really enjoyed having the opportunity to give my point of view. I thought the members of the subcommittee really engaged at a very substantive level. I answered over a dozen questions, and the other witnesses also answered quite a few questions. So I think it was a really, like you said, it was a substantive hearing. I think there's a lot of room for this to continue. There's a lot of room for momentum. But the thing that I really want to emphasize as well is FINRA can take action on many of these concepts, even if the subcommittee and ultimately Congress don't take action on all of them. Like there's a lot of room for FINRA to implement at least some elements of these recommendations as well. For example, one of the recommendations that I included to sort of take it full circle is the issue of regulation by enforcement and how to avoid it. One of the recommendations in the SEC white paper I co-authored was for the SEC to consider codifying a definition of regulation by enforcement. And I also included that as a recommendation for FINRA to consider codifying a definition of regulation by enforcement. So there are recommendations that FINRA can already start working on. So, and I think that was really what was really exciting about this hearing, which is it was making recommendations to the subcommittee on how Congress should act, but it was also making recommendations directly to FINRA within the same vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point as well. FINRA, they're watching this hearing, no doubt. Anything that has to do with congressional oversight of the SROs, especially through that SEC oversight, they're definitely going to be very attuned to. And I'm sure they're very thankful for such a substantive hearing. And they do have, hopefully, a lot of good ideas that they can, integrate into their current process of that, that FINRA forward process and potentially coming out on their own with some of these changes rather than waiting either for the SEC or Congress. Well, before we head out for today, Valerie, is there anything else you'd like to talk about the hearing, about the experience, any other kind of thoughts before we end for today?
I did want to touch on the fact that the subcommittee was interested in raising issues related to digital assets, cryptocurrency, and the role of artificial intelligence and technology. I really think those are some perennial topics for those of us in securities. I think it's changing how, all of these areas are changing how regulators are viewing an entire asset class, meaning digital assets. But artificial intelligence is also evolving very rapidly, giving regulators further tools to fight fraud. You and I did an episode in January about how artificial intelligence is used by industry firms to fight fraud. And, all of those topics also were raised during the hearing. I do think they're perennial and important topics for those of us in the securities industry, whether we're, defense attorneys, government relations professionals, compliance professionals, in-house, outside law firm, outside vendor to the industry. Like, these topics are going to stay perennial as well. So I wanted to flag that.
Yeah, no, and that's a great flag, Valerie. And I think you're absolutely right because, a lot of the conversations going on right now, you'll hear a lot about, SEC's jurisdiction, CFTC's jurisdiction, how do we regulate artificial intelligence or cryptocurrencies? I think sometimes FINRA gets lost, but, FINRA's put out guidance on the use of artificial intelligence for their members, and they've put out guidance on cryptocurrency for their members as well. So I think that is a really important point.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. But William, you had a couple of quick updates to touch on today as well.
Yeah, so I've talked about midterms coming up. We'll see kind of where we go from here as far as the makeup of Congress, how that will impact oversight of the SEC and by virtue of that oversight of FINRA. But, also moving forward, I think that it'll be interesting to see whether the SEC as well gets involved with some of these determinations. Obviously, the SEC has to review any proposals put out by FINRA, so they do have a role to play as well. So, I think in the coming months, I know there's a marketing rule right now. They're trying to align FINRA marketing rule with the SEC marketing rule. So we'll kind of see where that goes. But I think there is a real effort right now, even, broader than the regulatory agencies with SEC working more with CFTC, SEC working more with FINRA. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how those align over the coming months.
Especially the SEC CFTC relationship around crypto. I think that is really interesting, unprecedented in its closeness. And just, I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of the product of the crypto roundtables, in terms of any rulemaking and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And with their Project Crypto, we just did see a rule pop up at the White House's Office Management Budget, OMB, that does deal with the interpretation of what digital assets would be considered securities. So that will be very interesting. It looks, as far as I can tell, a formal rulemaking that would be followed by notice and comment rather than just some type of guidance that necessarily doesn't go through that process. So that's going to be really interesting to see when that comes out, and that could come out in the next few weeks or the next few months. So just congratulations again on a successful hearing and looking forward to continuing season 3. I know everyone loves hearing us chat, but I know we're going to have some guests coming back on over the next couple months. And as we've said before, there's never a shortage of interesting things to talk about in the securities regulation world.
No, it is one of the things that's really wonderful about being a part of this industry. So I look forward to our April episode. Thank you again, William, and to our listeners. Till next time.